This is the pattern for the ballet bodice set out front to back. Here's center front. Here's the side front, piece number 2. Side front, piece number 3. Side back, piece number 4. Center back, piece number 5. The side seam happens between pieces number 4 and 3. When you're looking at the back pattern pieces, it's important to understand that this area here and here will be filled in by the side back piece. Notice that these 3 notches match the 3 notches here, and then this curved shape will be stitched here to the waist. Take a look at the seam allowances. This pattern says 1 inch seam allowance all around. This says the same. This one says side seam plus 2 inches seam allowance. This the same. And at center back plus 2 inches seam allowance. Notice that the grain lines for pieces 1, 2, and 3 put the pieces on the bias. Side back and center back are straight grain. There are also bone lines marked on the pattern which need to be transferred when you mark out the base layer. Here, here, here. This is 1 layer of tracing paper with the wax side up, 1 piece of cotton back satin folded so that the dull side is in the interior. I'll be marking on the shiny side, and this is the 2nd layer of wax paper. So now I've laid out my pattern pieces, and I'm just trying to figure out an efficient layout that will make everything work well together. I can feel the fold of the cotton back satin underneath here. I know I need 1 inch here. I need 2 inches here, so I make sure I have, and then 1 inch here, so I'll make sure I have 3 inches at the top there. I need 1 inch all around that one, so I'm making sure I've got 2 there. And the same here. Generally speaking, I like to cut everything with the top going the same way, but that will make very inefficient layout for this. So I'm going to turn my center back of my bodice piece upside down so it will snuggle in a little better. To make sure that the grain of my pattern lines up with the grain of my fabric, I'm going to set my piece in a place that there's enough seam allowance around it and put a pin in one end of the grain line. Then I'm going to measure from that grain line. On this edge, it's to the fold, but on the other edge, it'll be to the selvage, and then line up the other end of the grain. We'll do the same for all the other pattern pieces. When I peel this back, it's a little bit tricky. I can see my pieces. And before I go any further, I'm just going to double check each piece and make sure that I have marked everything out and write center back, center front, side seam, etc. So there's the center back. And I know I want 2 inches of seam allowance there. So I'm just going to mark that lightly here and here. And then if I'm having any trouble at all seeing my lines, before I move or touch anything, I go back with a pencil and dot it in. So here's the ballet bodice marked out. There's the center back, 2 inches of seam allowance, lots of space around it, 2 inches of seam allowance here. These 3 pieces on the bias, and the side back piece here, 2 inches of seam allowance here, and 2 inches of seam allowance here. The center front panel requires stiff stuff in between the cotton back satin and the face fabric. There are 2 ways of doing this. You can mark the stiff stuff with the pattern piece and cut it out without seam allowance. The alternative method is to line up the straight grain of the stiff stuff with the straight grain of the cotton satin and then pin around the center front piece. Here it is pinned out. Notice that my pins are on an angle from my stitching line. Now I flipped it over and trimmed it from the other side just so I don't have to fight with the big pieces of fabric. Now I'm going to quilt the stiff stuff to the cotton back satin. Here's the cotton back satin joined to the stiff stuff. The stiff stuff is on the dull side of the cotton back satin, and I've stitched about 1/8 of an inch inside the stitching line. I press it to make sure it's going to lay beautifully flat, and then I can trim the extra seam allowance away from the stiff stuff. Now we need to put bone tape on the pieces where the bones happen in the interior rather than on the seam. That means center front, this bone ends here, and side back, these bones go all the way through the edges. So the tape for the side back is going to go into the seam allowance at the top and at the bottom, but on the front piece, the tape is going to go into the seam allowance on the bottom only and then fold under here. So you'll stitch from the bottom up one side of the tape, across, and down the other side. Here are the 2 side back bone casings. Here's the front bone casing, and the stiff stuff has been quilted to the dull side of the front piece.